Welcome to Artonaut, the podcast where we discuss the fascinating intersection of art and space exploration.
Our guest of today is Ralo Mayer, a Vienna-based artist, filmmaker, and researcher. Academically, Ralo completed an artistic research PhD titled Space and Settlements, focusing on the interplay of experimental designs for future extraterrestrial living and terrestrial realities. Warm welcome to you, Ralo. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I would like to start a little bit with so when we read about your practice, it was named performative research. Maybe for the listeners and viewers who are not so familiar, we would like to ask you to a little bit elaborate on your practice and what does it look to be a performative researcher?
First of all, thanks for the invitation. It's a big pleasure. Um, I think there's many notions of performative research. The way I go about it is basically has a background into activities many years ago. On the one hand, I had a job at theater, like a big theater in Austria and German speaking countries, and doing video there. But I was very much impressed in the end about the process of how scripts came on stage and how this basically the text suddenly transformed into a 3D or 4D entity with very different actors in that. So like actors in a more broader sense, not only the actors on stage, but also the props, the director, the stage designers, also but everyone basically working in theater. And I found that interplay during the rehearsal process very interesting. So my idea was, can I introduce, is it possible to introduce this kind of rehearsal practices and this also in the end playful approach towards research based art in a way? So what I'm doing is I'm trying to include things like scripts or thinking about roles or also using props in order to play research also, but playing in a very serious sense, like playing for children is also a very serious activity. I mean, it's fun, but they're very dedicated, so I like that in a way. And the other background is basically also theories of performativity, but it also had a very kind of hands-on experience from my side, which I was very lucky to have.
Maybe you could tell us what are you working on at the moment, or perhaps what are you aspiring to start working very soon?
Basically, since I don't know how long is it now, because I usually work very long on things. So since a couple of years, I've been working a lot with meteorites, and among other things, I started to lick meteorites. And with the background being that I thought of how can we as humans kind of build or change a relation not only to non-human but also in the end like non-terrestrial objects. And yeah, so that's a big thing. And right now I'm lucky to have funding for a short postdoc starting launch thing. And through that I explore right now different kinds of meteorite cultures, so human activities in the past but also very much in the present of working with non-terrestrial material. And basically I do this in order to perhaps learn more about potential future uses of non-terrestrial resources, what is commonly known as space mining.
Yeah, we wanted to ask you more actually about meteorite leaking a little bit later in our conversations and get back to that topic. But since you're already mentioning your work on extraterrestrial subjects, we also know that your work interweaves retro futures with contemporary speculations to examine societal transformations. And this is often done through the lens of space travel. And naturally, we are curious how and why you started to explore the subject of space in your work.
While I was still studying for basically the master degree at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, I was involved more in the broadest sense activist practices and documentary practices. And at one point, I felt right around when I finished there, um, I I had a feeling that kind of certain limits of such practices. And then at the same time, I got interested in science fiction. So I was not so much into science fiction as a kid. But suddenly I was very interested. And back then I understood science fiction very much as a sort of hidden documentary genre, which I wouldn't subscribe to so much right now, because I think the speculation part is perhaps more interesting even. So it's not about the kind of a documentary genre about the present times. Yeah, and space travel is basically, I mean, it's a common theme in science fiction, of course, and through that, basically, I think I've been starting working about space a lot, and what I like about space the most is that it's really possible to get into a dialogue with a broader audience through it, and especially coming from an art context and where there's only so much people who are interested in contemporary art, uh, and arguably also not so much people interested in political discussions or social discussions. I mean, this is growing. I think space is quite interesting, like to start a conversation with people and then kind of through that discuss other things. So I'm interested in the relation of the back and forth between space and Earth and reality and fiction, whereas on both sides this is interchangeable, I think.
Yeah, I was looking through your portfolio and there was one sentence that I really liked, which was Wer schlecht sucht, findet. And I found it very funny as a reference to this concept of serendipity, but also very relatable because I find, so just to give a little bit of context, maybe you can also translate it better, but how I understand it, it's about this, like, it doesn't matter how hard we try to do our research and how serious we are, but often we are led by all these happy accidents, maybe even a bit how we met each other. And I just wanted to ask how is it represented in your practice, and just wanted you to a little bit elaborate on how these kind of happy accidents are leading your research in a way.
So this wer schlecht sucht findet, it came up in basically in exchange with my supervisor, Ferdinand Schmatz, and a PhD supervisor, and he's a poet and writer, and we're not quite sure. So there, and we couldn't quite find out because there is a proper quote on that, which I don't remember right now, which is from someone else, but we both misinterpreted it, and it's kind of an interesting way of describing artistic research, because it's always, there's this saying of best practice, and artistic research is probably in a different way the best practice of research, or a bad practice of research, as it's often being criticized. And I also in my thesis, which is a time of reflection of your work in a way, which is the great thing about it. And I more and more thought about kind of my own inability in a way to do proper research, and to what other things that led me. And I had certain moments, especially during that time, where I basically fucked up doing research. So I went to a place and did bad research before, and then was there and then found out, oops, what I'm gonna do now. And these things actually then, I mean, now it sounds funny, but there's a lot of desperation at that moment, of course, when you like realize, oops. I can't do what I planned. But within that process, I found other things which turned out very interesting in a way, and so I kind of reflected on the notion of serendipity a bit, and did a bit digging in the past of it and how the word was invented, etc. And it's serendipity has become kind of almost I don't know, it's gotten a bad reputation, I think, because it's been used so ubiquitous. You say ubiquitous, yeah. In relation to startups and all this kind of neoliberal economy. But at the core, I think it's really a beautiful thing within very different practices of research, which don't only have to be academic or scientific. So really to find something else and to be open in the end in a process.
Yeah, it indeed became quite a buzzword, and it's something that in the next subject we want to discuss. I think there was quite a lot of serendipity research driven done, but just to tell audience about our chance encounter, I want to tell that we met a couple of months ago at the International Astronautical Congress that was held in Milano this year. And we both presented our projects during a session dedicated to space culture. On our slides that was presenting this project of Artonaut podcast, we showed a preview of a previous episode called All Artists Crew. And you noticed the familiar view of the Biosphere 2. And it turned out you had a very special relationship to that place. Maybe you could tell us a bit about how did you get involved with the Biosphere 2 story? How did it become a part of your practice?
So this must have been around 2007 or something, so really a long time ago. And I came out of a kind of dysfunctional collaboration, art and architects and other people collaboration. And so as it goes with these things, it's also always an emotional thing. And then I don't know how I first heard about it again, or maybe I remembered from my youth, from the 90s, basically, a story about 8 people living inside a greenhouse for 2 years. And at the time, I was visiting my partner in who was living for some months in Los Angeles, and then I basically read a memoir of one of these crew members, and I was very fascinated by their own group dynamics, to call it very neutral, and basically also their group trouble in there. And so this was my entry point. And on the other hand, I was fascinated by it because I was doing some work on models at that time, which is a common trope of science fiction, like miniature worlds, etc. And then I also remember this kind of from the 90s, this half-forgotten project, which is basically the model of the world, because Biosphere 2 is a small world. So it has 8 or 9 of the most common, or the most important biomes of the world in there. And so it's a small world that these 8 people lived in. And but the more research I did about it, the more I found out how much it's really situated at a very specific moment in time, being the early 90s, which was such a time of global transformations in the end. And I first I came for the drama, but I stayed for the stories, and this continued then for a very long time. And I might be finished with my work on Biosphere 2, but I never know. So at one point I found out I've been working on Biosphere 2 longer than it took these people to build it. So which was kind of embarrassing. And so through that process I got to know the main people who built it very good, and have been in exchange with them, and also friendship. And it's a very beautiful project. Yeah.
It's a very well-known project and many people know about it, but maybe just in a few words you can tell what was the purpose and why was it built, because it is still good to put it in words.
So basically it's a what is it, in 1.5 hectares or something? I'm not good with numbers. It's a huge closed ecosystem, a greenhouse built in the late 80s in Arizona near a town called Oracle, which is also one of the stories. Where else? And it's been built by basically to on exploring two goals. The one goal was to learn more about how it would be to live in a self-sustaining closed ecosystem on another planet, for instance on Mars, where you would have to recycle everything. So within this structure, basically the water cycles and the air cycles were closed. So all these things were recycled. The crew grew their own food for 2 years. But the other purpose was also like to learn more about the planetary ecological cycles on Earth. And that's why also they put in all these different biomes. So there was a rainforest in there. There was an ocean with a coral reef there. There was a small agriculture there. There was also a desert. So there was a desert closed off from the outside desert, which is perhaps, also interesting. And yes. And as I learned, and this was what was very intriguing to me, what I learned early on, is that these people who built it were not, let's call it, proper scientists, but they came out basically of San Francisco in the late 60s, so the counterculture, and they had started out as a theater troupe. And this theater troupe, as there were many experimental theater troupes at that time, they got very interested in Buckminster Fuller. They started exchanging with Fuller and also other people of that time, among them William Burroughs, for instance. And then they moved to New Mexico and worked with Adobe as one of the first people again, and slowly started to build bases around the globe, which was helped by the fact that one of these people living in this group was a Texan oil billionaire. And so they had some kind of an investing factor also in there. And at one point in the early 80s, they had a conference where they also discussed the idea of space settlements, which was kind of a virulent thing in the 70s and early 80s still. So in connection with the limits to growth, for instance, like if what were people thinking at that point, like if we have limited resources on Earth, why not go to other planets? Which is a discussion right now also, perhaps. And so at one of these conferences, they were discussing it, and then Buckminster Fuller, as the story goes, who's also part of that conference in France, and he asks them, so who can build such a thing? Why don't you do it? And so they started doing it. And in 91, in September 91, 26th of September, 8 people went into this closed system in Arizona and lived in there for 2 years. And the project was supposed to last for 100 years with changing crews. And there were also ideas that there might be a different evolution going on inside, etc. But then journalists at that time found out about the counterculture background. And this is also basically where we have to go back to this early 90s, where it was not the best time to talk about utopias, no, and different forms of society in the end. So the Soviet Union collapsed right during the project. For instance, also other socialist countries changed in that time, so these journalists found out that they were from the counterculture, and the end of history had just been declared. And so they become basically the target of jokes all the time. And people were asking, oh, these people don't have enough PhDs. How they're doing a performance? They're not doing proper science. So basically, these were artistic researchers before the developments of the past the 1 or 2 decades have actually established that field. And so they became a joke of late night shows on TV, and journalists were highly criticizing them, and there were all these discussions around it. And so in the end, the main investor, the Texas oil billionaire, brought in an investment banker, and that investment banker basically broke up Biosphere 2 and destroyed it. And the name of that investment banker is Steve Bannon, who later on became infamous in another context. So you see, there's I can ramble on for a much longer time on this, but just to give you a sort of impression how this project is very much connected. And I was especially interested in how it's really situated in the early 90s, because it's, on the one hand, I think it was a bit too late for this kind of post-classic space age ideas of space settlements. So the Challenger disaster happened in 86, and there was really not so much thinking about human futures in space anymore at that time. But then it was also just a tad too early, because it was really about ecological cycles and, in the end, human interactions with the environment, the so-called environment, so that we are part of it in a way. And so it was a bit too early for these discussions of global warming, etc., of a more widespread, and also technologically. So they used all this kind of video conference technologies, but the internet just was about to start, let's put it like that. So there were some earlier versions of it, but not quite widespread. And so it's really at this specific moment in time.
Yeah. But you mentioned they were criticized as a theater group and for the performative aspects of their work, but they also did it kind of intentionally, these performative actions. Maybe you can tell a little bit about the wrong stuff, because that's that gives it some context, right?
Basically, this group, they tried to establish a synergetic lifestyle since the late 60s, based on the principles of Buckminster Fuller. So each of them basically was supposed to do kind of, also out before Biosphere 2, farming work, have their own business, do philosophical discussions, engage in some creative work, etc. And really then through that kind of establish a new form of living together also. And a big part of that was more or less an everyday theater practices. So they would not only do plays to the public, but also use theatrical and improvisational methods, in the end, to work with group dynamics. And so, of course, also before or during the process of Biosphere 2, of building it, there were theater practices. And a couple of weeks before, the crew went in. They did a little theater sketch called The Wrong Stuff, which was a pun on Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff, which was about the first male US astronauts. And in this sketch, which is a really a funny sketch, so they're totally dressed up in colorful costumes, and basically they play that once they play their future life inside Biosphere 2, the crew, and everything that can go wrong goes wrong. So they run out of oxygen, they don't have enough food, they start to quarrel with each other. And it's kind of funny and tragic at the same time that all these things actually happened afterwards, in a way. So they already pre-enacted it, so to speak. And what's funny is, on the one hand, they've been criticized by journalists at the time for doing this, having this theater background, but the workload inside Biosphere 2 was so high, they didn't have enough time to continue their theater practice inside properly. And this could be one of the reasons why the group dynamics basically collapsed so much. and went so wrong. So this is it's probably the true tragedy of the project, that they were criticized for the theater, but in the end they didn't do it enough inside. And yeah, so it's what I like most, how the group now talks about it, and has been talking about it since, is that they refer to this idea that the experiment should have gone on for 100 years, and they say that the performance still continues, which is a very beautiful idea, that even though there is no human crew inside now for a long time, and the University of Arizona, as you know, has only recently started to connect to the past, so to speak, again. And they say that it still continues. And it's really interesting to look at the site there, but also at the different kind of plots that are threading around it. And so this one narrative of Steve Bannon popping up in 2017 in Donald Trump's campaign is just crazy. That it's so Biosphere 2 is still very much a miniature of both the planet and the global developments.
Yeah, talking about the narratives, I was thinking to touch a little bit upon, well, the first crew, of course, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on whether there were 8 or 9 of them, as your movie suggests, and in general, like on this kind of narrative that you brought in your storytelling about this place.
So this basically goes back and connects to this idea of performative research, and is an example of it, because when I basically fell into this rabbit hole of Biosphere 2, I thought, like, how do I go about this? And then I remembered a story that I had heard. I think it was Mark Nelson, one of the crew members, who had told it to me, and who I heard it about it first. And he told me that when the crew was inside, there was an El Nino phenomenon, which is, I think this year was also again. And so there was not enough sunlight, and they had a very hard time to grow enough food in their small agriculture. And every member of the crew lost up to 20% of their weight. And after a while, they were sitting with their like small meals and eating it for dinner, etc. And they discussed what's going to happen. And then they suddenly thought, like, okay, so we are all losing this weight, but it's a closed system, and it's totally so it's a physically closed environment, and so all these kind of individual losses remain inside. And then at one point they had this beautiful idea coming up, that basically the sum of their individual losses would have formed something of a ninth crew member, a ninth Biospherean, which is a very beautiful thought, especially in this kind of idea of the interaction of humans, technology, and so-called nature. And so I was going back to this anecdote from the first mission, and I was wondering, okay, so the humans are long out there, but what happened to this ninth Biospherean? So this kind of phantom crew member, is that kind of not so human, but originating from humans, but being not human anymore, or something else? What's the whereabouts of that phantoms? And so I thought, like, there should be a science fiction novel about that. And then I realized maybe I'm not the proper person to write it. So I postulated that there is already a science fiction novel called The Ninth Biospherean, which explores Biosphere 2 through this figure. And I'm the translator of that novel. And so my practice basically was, I stepped into this role of a translator of an imaginary science fiction novel, and translated that into various media. So that is exhibitions, installations, films, also text and performance. And so that's been basically my perspective on it.
I was literally looking everywhere on the internet to find the novel. I thought, did you write the novel or not? And it's nowhere to be found. Now we know it just doesn't exist. Okay. I really was curious to read the novel, actually. But yes, fun.
That, me too. Yes, I'd be very interested in it. No, so there's fragments of it and of the story, but basically it's a method and a tool basically to approach it. And it's not so much about like really making a fake or saying, oh, it really exists or something. So I'm very open about it, that it's imaginary, because it's just like a certain perspective to look at the project. Yeah.
And I believe since 2017, right, you started visiting the site yourself, and you were searching perhaps for Ninth Biospherean and doing all kinds of experiments on site. And yeah, I'm just curious, how did it feel to be there physically? What were your days like? And maybe did you camp inside? Just tell us about, let us be there with you.
So that's the first time I visited was with a friend in 2007, and that was right about the time when it had changed ownership to the University of Arizona. It's so it's really in the desert somewhere. You have to drive through some dirt roads there, and basically at that point it had been really totally in desolation for many years, because before that the Columbia University had taken it. They had basically all but erased the original history. So it was really something they tried to step away as far as possible. And when I was there, it was still, in 2007, at least the first time, it was a subject you wouldn't bring up. And there's a beautiful book, for instance, by Rebecca Rader, the what is it called? The Theater of All Possibilities, perhaps? I'm not sure right now. Rebecca Rader, and she was at Columbia University before that, so she experienced that, and it was really that something that you could only talk very, very in a low voice with other students, because you're not supposed to touch that these crazy people, the theater people, were here before. So now it's proper science, and so when I was there, this change of ownership had taken, it was more, and at that time it was also on the real estate market. So I have some drawings from that time, from around 2007, where real estate agents put it on the market, and there's this kind of sketches that envision it as a theme park or as a conference hotel or something, like totally changing it. And I think the main reason it didn't go in that direction was that the financial crisis of 2008 like buried all real estate developments at that time. And so University of Arizona could continue to work with it. And but to come back to my visit there, it was very easy to walk across the entire background also. So there were all these desolate and empty structures for tourists, because in 91 it had, I think, 1 million visitors per year. So it was a big spectacle there for tourists to visit. So they had a visitor center, they had a gift shop, they had all the research greenhouses, and all these things were basically empty. So this was Biosphere 2 was a very sad to look at that time, and very rusty and everything, but especially these attached structures were just totally space age ruins. And I'm also very fascinated with ruins, as probably a lot of people are, and so it was great to explore that and see all these structures. And this basically also continued. I think the second time I was there in 2009. And back then I had established some exchange with University of Arizona, and I was allowed to stay there in what was before and might be again now the so-called student village. And I had a great opportunity to also be in Biosphere 2 at night, for instance, which was when it really gets so close to an empty spaceship drifting somewhere. So you have this beautiful starry sky in the desert, above you. You have all these kind of technologies. Half of them are really clearly not working anymore. You have billions of cockroaches running around everywhere, and it's but it, so that's basically, I think that was the closest where I could get to this atmosphere of a Ninth Biospherean, I think. And through all that, they were still continuing to give guided tours to tourists, because it was not, I think it's been physically opened in the late 90s or something, and since then it's not a closed system anymore. So there is air going through it, etc. And yeah, and back then, so 2009 and until 2012, when I was there again, I did a lot of time lapse photography. So I have all this kind of footage where you really see the stars going around, and it looks a bit like a spaceship drifting in space somewhere. Yeah, but it's I can definitely recommend it, and I kind of like another story from the founders. So they built it intentionally because they always suspected they could run into some trouble during the project, and that it could be tried to be erased from history. And so uh, the whole structure is built really on a huge foundation of concrete, steel and concrete. And they said, like, even though it happened with many greenhouses, because they also, for some reason, these greenhouses tend to burn down, like the Crystal Palace in London. So even if this above ground structure is all gone, it would be very hard to get rid of the foundation because it's just there. And then they had this idea that perhaps at one point, like hundreds or thousands years into the future, some archaeologists might find this and wonder what was happening here. So you see that there was, on many levels, theatrical elements in the design of Biosphere 2.
So to switch a little bit the topic, I wanted to talk a bit more about ecology because it's kind of an ongoing theme that you also touch upon in the Biosphere too, but also in your other work. And one quote in particular that I also really liked, and I thought that it kind of a little bit explains your approach, was ecology has as much to do with nature as space exploration has to do with the vacuum of outer space. And I thought it's such a beautiful quote. And could you maybe please explain a bit more about how do you define ecology in your practice and what kind of role it plays in your performative research?
Yeah, I think this is very much connected to various theories, like probably beginning in the late 80s, early 90s. Basically, that describe the collapse of this dichotomy and of the spheres of nature, of the divided spheres of nature and culture and human society. That this kind of, and I mean, I think it becomes very interesting again if you kind of put this discussion into space, and a lot of other people have also done it from the background of social studies of outer space. So thinking about the Anthropocene in relation to space. So the Anthropocene, that humans have changed the planetary system in a way, but you can also expand that. So it's usually very often discussed in relation to sediments, if so going down, but you can understand it in terms of the orbit of Earth, which has been changed for a long time, probably through all the space junk in the end also. And we've also started to intervene into other planet or celestial bodies in the end, like the moon. Basically, the Apollo astronauts left a lot of trash there, make it very blunt, and also on Mars. So there's it's not a big impact by now, but you can see a direction. So the Anthropocene is not basically, it's not limited to Earth in a way. And yeah, so I got interested especially in this because ecology is very so often connected with life, and then if you think about outer space, it's all mostly described as a dead space, but then it's not. And historically, from the very first sketches of space travel, from, for instance, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, he already did sketches of spaceships that are basically greenhouses. So they have this, I don't know, early 20th, late 19th century sketches of greenhouses in space, where basically farmers are floating around in there and they use the sunlight. And so this is one angle to it. But then if you think about ecology, and this is perhaps also this interesting fiction of the closed system, because the Earth is also not so closed. So without the sun, there wouldn't be anything going on. So it's very much open, and there's a lot of non-terrestrial material, cosmic dust, etc., raining down every day. There's all these theories that perhaps let's conservatively speaking, like the elements that later on formed the first life organic molecules come from space, etc., through meteorites. So yeah, that was not the question though.
But I think it's a very important notion that we all have to remind ourselves about, right? That it is all connected. We are not in this, we look at this blue marble and we see it so distant as an entity on its own, but it is not. So it is, it's good that you remind us. And you even talking about Anthropocene, space, and greenhouses in space. I don't know if you coined the term or you kind of tweaked the word or you tell better about it, but the word that you use and introduce in the next theme of the conversation, dash or little dot earthing, maybe you can tell, if you actually coined the term or it was existing before, and what does it mean?
I think there's a lot of people working with the notion of unearthing for a couple of years.
But also with the dash, with the little circle.
No, it's called a space dot. I found out typographically it's called a space dot.
Space dot. Sorry.
It's a dot in the middle, and so there's sometimes it's called interpunct, but sometimes it's called space dot, which I like in my in the relation. I wouldn't say coined, but basically I thought about this other notion of unearthing during a project I did at the Expo site in Osaka from Expo 70, not the next one coming in 25. And because I was looking at some drone photos that I did, and I looked down at the remnants of basically space age architecture. And I saw this kind of also the foundation again in the ground. And I think you mentioned it before, like you said, like some retro futures. And obviously I've been working a lot about past and lost futures. And this, as many other artists do, and researchers. And so there's a certain importance of that, like not to forget these things. But then I think there's in my case, I'm also faced with this kind of nostalgic and almost sad view that one has to look into the past all the time. And so I looked at this image that I had taken from the air of this foundation of space age architecture at the Expo site, and I thought, well, again, I'm unearthing some lost futures. And then in that moment, I realized perhaps I can understand the very word of unearthing literally in the other direction. So not looking down into the earth, digging up hidden layers from the past, but maybe used as an intransitive verb. So how humans are unearthed in the end through our exchange with outer space. And very much in that moment of sadness about my own practice, I thought like maybe that's something to work in the direction of, and that's what I've been doing the past year. So basically, in my understanding, it's unearthing with this space dot would be kind of a whole range of transformations of humans and human cultures through and by outer space. And it's very important that I don't only understand, I wouldn't say this is only for astronauts. I don't know how many astronauts, how many people have been to space, around 200, I guess, so far. So this is more a very common thing. So it's also through mediation, through images, through experiences, through fiction that has been going on for over 100 years at least, or longer probably. And then a good example of that would be the impact of the blue marble, of the whole Earth photos, or of Earthrise in the end, because I think Earthrise or blue marble, I think the blue marble photo is one, might be the most published image in the history of humanity, and probably a high percentage of humans in across different cultures have seen this image. And what does this do? I mean, there's been written a lot about that, what that does to us, but this very process, basically, that it made us all astronauts in the end also, and unearthed ourselves. And and very specifically, I'm also, and that's what I'm doing right now, I'm interested again, because unearthing in the rather earthly sense, you can also think about mining and the extraction of resources as a practice of unearthing. So it's not only an archaeological practice or an artistic practice to unearth something and to have another look and to dig up hidden layers, but there's also obviously going on extraction practices and also colonial practices around that to bring something from the ground. And if you connect that then to the notion of unearthing, it becomes a bit of twisted again, because right now a lot of people are thinking of how to extract resources in space, and that's what I'm interested in, and other people also working right now about. And so basically, what does it mean? How are human cultures unearthed by the unearthing of resources that have never been in the earth before? So what does it mean to extract resources from the moon or from asteroids?
If I understand it right, we can all say that we are already undergoing the process of unearthing, being exposed to those stories and images, etc. But have you been intentionally perhaps trying to subject yourself to certain practices of unearthing? Is there something you would advise or suggest we could try?
We all do on a daily basis.
If we want to try to unearth even more.
Yeah, I mean, you can just go outside and I mean, not now in winter, but like lay down somewhere on the grass and open your mouth widely and think about the cosmic dust that you ingest and how it unearths you. And on a more institutionalized, in the double sense of it, in a more institutional sense, I've been doing a workshop for some years now, where basically I invite people to lick meteorites, among other things. So basically, as a kind of to reflect on our relation with non-terrestrial objects, and so this was also one of the first artistic works that I did. I was on unearthing, was 21 or 2021. I was invited by the curator Jakob Lillemose to a show at the Medical Museum in Copenhagen, which was called The World is in Us, and which kind of inverted the view of the Anthropocene, so that not only humans are changing the world, but of course also the world is changing the human body. And there was also a space section in there, and I developed basically two works. In the one work, I thought about maybe are there pharmaceutical ways to prepare ourselves for space? And this was also very much in the context of COVID-19. And at that time, there was a lot of talk on pharmaceutical solutions to the bigger problem, which of course, I mean, there's not a pharmaceutical solution to COVID-19, as we have found out. It's a broader thing. And so I was kind of thinking if there could be a vaccine, for instance, we could be vaccinated in preparation for living in space. And I got an exchange with the Institute of Pharmaceutical Technology at the University of Vienna. And to my biggest surprise, they agreed to collaborate. And they said, we can't do any vaccinations because if we put meteoritic dust in vaccinations, you'll die. And I wanted to do proper things, so not fake. And so I asked, okay, what can we do? What are you doing there? And they said, oh, we very often do, so we can do effervescent tablets. You know, these tablets that you put in water, make bubbles. And the other thing that we often do is suppositories. And I kind of like this pair a lot because with effervescent tablets, for me, it's a very easygoing self-optimization. Oh, let's just put some vitamins in there, or it's a bit like the Californian way of pharmaceutics, so to say. So a little of self-improvisation, self-optimization, and suppositories are very much the opposite. So no one talks so much about taking suppositories, and it's also connected to kids. So with kids, you often use suppositories, and yeah. So this was basically I basically did these two pharmaceutical products for that show. So with meteoritic dust and with dust from the moon, from the Mars, and from the asteroids. And it's a big, basically a question mark, as the workshops are, like how is our relation and with space, and people often ask, oh, is it dangerous if I now lick this, if I try some dust?
I was actually curious about it because I feel like because this work is so body centric, it gives such a interesting way for people to think about their connection with a space through that. So, like, did you notice that the reaction of the audience was more, or like if they took it more personal somehow, because that was something that they were, I don't know, considering if that would be harmful or not harmful for their own body somehow?
Yes, so I think it's this back and forth between the personal and social questions to it in the end, and broader questions. So when I do the workshop, like I introduce it with basically a small lecture performance on the natural, but especially cultural history of meteorites, how human cultures have been working with meteorites for a long time, and but also I give also a kind of a glimpse into the future, because and the workshop is called Space Acts, after a law, after a short name of a law that has been implemented in the US in 2015, the Space Act, which basically was the first time that a nation state allowed its citizens and its companies through that to extract resources and sell resources in space, which arguably is in violation to the Outer Space Treaty. But there's still legal discussions, and there has been also at the Astronautical Congress a lot of discussions still about that. But basically, there is a range of countries who have implemented similar laws since then. So basically, now we are, at least in a legal sense, we are already in the age of space mining. So this trope of space mining, which has been in science fiction since over 100 years, has been translated into legal reality already. And so basically the people, so it's two questions when the people start tasting moon meteorite dust or lick meteorites, so they can ask themselves, is it harmful to my body? And then I can tell them, okay, so the little dust that you just tried is basically your annual dose that you get from cosmic dust, which are very rough calculations from my side, but that to give some answer to that. But now, by having this relation to your own meteorite, which I present them, you perhaps more important than if the question if it's dangerous and harmful to your own body is perhaps the question, like, what is your human and our human relation to this material from space? So is it something that we really want to continue in such a kind of capitalist fashion of just thinking about how to make money out of it? Or what could be other relations to it? Yeah, so this is kind of the range. in a way I try to touch there. And I'm very happy with the format, and I'm gonna continue it in the planetarium in Vienna next year, hopefully. Also with an even broader audience there from the Volkshochschule, and yeah, I don't know if you talk to random people on the street about extractivism and colonial exploitation of resources, it's very hard to start a conversation on that directly with people. But if you say, "Oh, here's a meteorite. Have you ever have a meteorite in your hand?" And then maybe it's a good point to start these discussions. So it's very much about contemporary and the Earth as well.
What we haven't covered so far in our talk, and I think is very important part of your work, is the fascination with the sci-fi genre. And in the documentaries that you produce, you use a lot of references, well, as far as we have seen, to space science fiction movies. And maybe you can mention a little bit about how does this influence this popular media, for example, influence and shape your research and your creative practice.
Yeah, I mean, as you notice, it's very much a Western canon of science fiction in the end, and because this also, especially with US films from the 80s, so basically this is what I grew up with, and I mean, it's a separate and interesting discussions, like how much kind of in the 80s a lot of people were formed by a certain a certain range of films in the end, so which has accumulated in the past years then with Stranger Things, which is kind of puts those all together and these tropes from back then. That's why it's been such a success with people, because they remember their childhood basically. And so it's very much in the Western canon and how that shaped me, and so I kind of tried to critically engage with that and reflect on that also. But like looking back on these films is also interesting, kind of from a critical perspective, and to reread them then. So, for instance, I watched E.T. probably when I was 6 or 7 years old, when it was in the cinema, and I had more or less forgotten about it, and just had these blurry memories that I was just totally blown away, and kids can't distinguish between fiction and reality, so I want to have such a friend also. And but then after years and years of that I have been researching Biosphere 2, I thought like, maybe I should watch this old film again, E.T. I suddenly realized that basically the spaceship in ET is a biosphere. So the extraterrestrials are botanists, they are scientists, they are collecting samples on Earth. The reason ET stays on Earth is because they collect a little redwood seedling in the redwoods in California, and so oops, now the others have left without me, and so it was very interesting to see this there, and yeah, so I connected this a lot with Biosphere 2 then, and made up a little fiction of perhaps that ET visited Biosphere 2 also in the end, and yeah. But there's so there's certain basically I think myths, modern and postmodern myths that I feel connected to, and another one would be, an older one would be the myth of Frankenstein's monster, which also very well connects with Biosphere 2, but is also such an influential narrative for modernity and for Western culture. And also, I mean, what is often forgotten about that, it's also a narrative about having a child and children, which is it's a wonderful text. So
We actually rewatched, well, I rewatched, I'm not so sure, Anna, if you watched for the first time E.T. while preparing for this conversation, really enjoyed it. And yeah, as a moon gallery, we kind of dream of the humanities as a spacefaring culture. And we think of the ideas that are worth sending to the moon as an ideas that are worth promoting into the future. And we wanted to ask you as a documentary maker and avid cinephile to suggest to our audience your top 5 favorite movies that you would share with the future interplanetary humans.
It's interesting because when you say interplanetary humans, like I think by now everyone thinks of Elon Musk because he's the main promoter of that. So I think it should be movies that question that mindset in a way, if that's possible. Yeah. So I've mentioned E.T. I think, which is a wonderful story on many layers in a way if you reread it. Then a film that I've also liked a lot, which is very complex in many ways in our relation with technology, also is Silent Running by Douglas Trumbull. It's from 1972. Basically, which is a film that there's this famous poem by Richard Brautigan, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, which also Adam Curtis made a documentary series under that name. But basically, Silent Running is basically the same stories that in the end the robots take care of ecology. A probably less known film, especially outside of German-speaking countries, is from a German filmmaker Alexander Kluge. In German, it's Willy Tobler und der Untergang der sechsten Flotte, which translates as Willy Tobler and the Destruction of the Sixth Fleet. And it's so it comes out basically out of German New Wave 60s, 70s films, and it's many things, but first of all, it's a translation of the Battle of Stalingrad into space, but it also involves economic and intergalactic economy and other questions, but all that through a very hilarious cast and really almost DIY low-level effects, etc. So very beautiful film. So the scene I like most, like it shows, which I've never seen in a science fiction film. So you see like a nuclear family fleeing from a war in a spaceship. And so all of a sudden they start to quarrel. They have these family arguments in the spaceship, which is really ridiculous, but so much on point. So yeah, with a Bavarian accent. It's it's wonderful, wonderful, ridiculous, and what else? I think there's a version on YouTube which is auto translated, which is okay by now. So it's not your average science fiction film. It's really kind of over the top, but I really loved it, and I love the actors and the filmmaking, and it's it's another form of science fiction, and I don't know, some art film maybe. La Région Centrale, if I pronounce it correctly, from Michael Snow. Do you know this? He in the 70s he constructed a machine that turned a camera on all axes, and then he put that in the most remote area in Canada he could find, which is by chance also I think called La Région Centrale or something like that. And then for 180 minutes, it's really a tough film to watch. It's the opposite of E.T. You see the camera scanning in all kinds of motions this landscape, and you really it's a very different perspective on Earth. And so it's basically like if you think about a Mars rover going rogue in a way and getting mad in a way and doing all these panoramas that we know from Mars, but like on Earth in the 70s shot. It's a good film. Yeah. I don't know. I also liked High Life by Claire Denis. some years ago, which is also introduces also the question which is so much ignored by most science fiction of kids in space, and what does it mean? Like, speaking of unearthing, for me, this is kind of really a question like, what happens when the first humans are not so much born, but especially raised in space? So what does it change? You know, so when you're talking about the International Space Station, everyone always asks, like, how is the toilet? How do you use the toilet, right? But like, people never ask, like, how do you change diapers? Because that's the real mess in microgravity. If you start to think about changing a diaper. And so high life is I like that also, because it also has a different approach to science fiction than the classic heroic Hollywood approach.
Thank you so much for sharing these inspiration sources. I would like to thank you for joining today's discussion. It was a real pleasure, and thank you for sharing so much stories and inspiration with us. For our audience, I suggest to stay tuned for the next episodes. We kind of embarked on this storyline about the artists in analog mission experiments. So let's see where it brings us. And if you want to learn more about what is happening in the Biosphere 2 now, check out our previous episode with the last artist crew of the Biosphere 2.
Thanks so much.
So